call everybody over. It's good to have everyone take their seats again. Thank you so much. We'll be continuing our theme. We had a really great discussion on the human experience. And I think we're going to talk about the human experience and climate change. So thank you so much to the UN and Dan Thomas, who'll be moderating this session.
All right, so thanks very much for joining us. We're going to crack on because we don't have very long. But we're going to have a really packed 20-minute discussion about how civil society and the United Nations have worked together and apart on climate action and to achieve this revolution that the world is seeing. I'm Dan Thomas. I'm the Communication Director for the Office of the President of the United Nations General Assembly, and I've worked on climate change and then sustainable development since I joined the UN 2.5 years ago. Now, I am joined by a very distinguished panel. On my left is Paula Caballero, the Global Director of the Climate Program of the World Resources Institute, Roberto Barrero, the UN representative for the International Indian Treaty Council, and on the far left, my colleague Susan Alsner from the United Nations Non-Governmental Liaison Service. Now, I'd like to take you back to the Climate Summit, September 2014, when I think the world and the narrative around climate change really began to change in a more positive direction, and was, I think, a crucial step to where we are today, seeing countries come to the UN with their instruments of ratification, bringing to the Secretary General, and the idea that this extraordinary success that we saw in Paris can actually be implemented much earlier than expected. So, Paula, I'd like to start with you. Talk about this change. Where have we come from since the climate summit of September 2014? And where are we now? And where are we going?
Well, thank you, Dan. I think that the climate summit was really very decisive because it galvanized political momentum at a very, very high level. And I think people started to realize how much climate is really about development. The climate is at the core of development. It changed that narrative. But nobody, I think, at that point expected Paris to be as successful and as ambitious as it was. The ratchet mechanism for ambition that came out of Paris is something that is incredible momentum. And that momentum is what's so exciting about what happened today, because we already overcame one of the two thresholds for having the Paris Agreement enter into force. And the fact that this happened just 9 months after we negotiated it, I'm not an expert in international treaty law, but I think that this is unprecedented, and that kind of momentum is what was sparked a year ago, and we're carrying it forward. The key thing now is to keep that momentum going.
Terrific. Roberta, you were there at the Climate Summit. You were part of that extraordinary march in New York that we saw, with civil society really coming around under the leadership, the encouragement of the Secretary General on climate action, and to get world leaders to really put this at the top of their agenda, way ahead, more than a year ahead of the Paris COP21 meeting. How do you feel the world has been changing in the last couple of years?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. I really appreciate the question, because when you talk about momentum, I think as indigenous peoples, we see momentum happening, right? And for our peoples who are often at the front lines of climate change, this momentum and this visibility is needed. At the climate march, for example, we really had to push to get our people in the front of the line, to the front, to remind people that indigenous peoples are pretty much the canaries in the coal mine in this whole dialogue. Because while our peoples only represent about 5% of the world population, our peoples are also represent about 15% of the world's poor. We have about our traditional territories across this earth comprise probably about 25% of the world's surface, and we still control about 80% of the world's biodiversity is still found in indigenous peoples' territories. So this momentum, this visibility is of course important to our people, but what we see is that, while we are at the forefront, you know, and the rhetoric has been very good. The talk has been very good. Implementation now is what we're looking at, because we want to make sure that the talk is equal to the visibility and the respect for our rights on the ground.
Now, before we talk about implementation, I want to take Susan back to Copenhagen. You were there. You were part of organizing a march in Copenhagen, a march, I guess, a precursor to the big march that we saw in New York, that extraordinary support shown to leadership on climate action. Take yourself back to Copenhagen. How have things changed since then? Where were we then? Where are we now?
I mean, the primary thing I've noticed is a lot more unity in the climate movement as a whole. When I was in Copenhagen in 2009, my job was to see if we could organize a demonstration for COP15.
Right.
Many of the civil society groups were at odds on various positions, and it was at that time I put forward, why don't we just agree to disagree and stand up for climate action, march for climate action. And so we had a very sort of general call for the march, and established a peaceful, family-friendly motivation. And then so we got, some say 200,000 people on the street in Copenhagen in the middle of December to march 6 kilometers to the climate change negotiation site.
Right.
Now, the difference then was it was a really protracted negotiation to enable the march to send some representatives in to do a handover to the executive secretary. And then in 2014, I had the good fortune to meet you, Dan, and I think we had a very short conversation, and I said we should allow some representatives from the march on the streets of New York City to come inside the UN, and you said, well, how would you do that? And I said, we'll let them decide. We'll open up a call for applications to the world. And you said, sounds great. And then we got to go and build it. And that then changed the nature of civil society participation at the UN. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome. So there we were. We had a climate summit. The narrative started changing. Leaders started getting engaged. The Secretary General encouraged them to really make this their issue, to take the world towards Paris. Then we saw an agreement in Paris at the last minute. That was a nail-biter, but we got there in the end. And here we are to today. Paula, tell us about today. What does today's instruments of ratification process that we saw in the General Assembly this morning, where does that take us, and how does that move us further forward?
Look, I think that sometimes we get into a conversation about early entry into force and whether it was going to happen or not. We talked about it, and it seemed not that long ago a possibility that was very remote. And it's happening as we speak. As I said earlier, we've already gone through over the first threshold, and I think it's almost fairly certain that it's going to enter into force this year. Whether it does so ahead by the 6th of October, so that we can have the first CMA, which basically just means the first meeting of the parties of this new agreement during the COP or not, is almost a moot point, because what we're talking about momentum is the fact that this is already going into force this year, just 1 year after it was adopted. And going forward, I mean, we keep talking, okay, we're done with the negotiations and now's the time for implementation. And I think now is where we really need to take that momentum also of looking at the nexus of the Paris Agreement and the SDGs, which was the other huge milestone that we agreed to last year. Because that is a universal agenda. It's a recognition that this is a shared planet. And we talk about a carbon budget, but there's also so many other planetary boundaries that we're breaching. So unless we take a good hard look at all of these issues, climate change and everything that is going to be needed to deliver on the climate action as a core part of development, and for countries to really see that it's in their own self-interest to act at the scale and with the urgency that's needed, that I think is the momentum, and that's what all of us need to do in these coming months and in the coming years, is not lose the momentum and make sure that the cost of inaction and the price of action is well understood by everybody. Because as you were saying very clearly, this is not for governments, this is not for NGOs, it's not for private sector, it's for everybody to really pull together, figure out what do you bring to the table, what's the most that you can do. And if we all push in that direction, I'm absolutely convinced that we will be able to keep to the promise of Paris, which is to go as close to possible and to keep as close to possible to 1.5.
Roberta, where do we take the movement? Where do you take the movement from here? You've led an indigenous movement for climate action. We have a new 2030 agenda for sustainable development. The two agendas are kind of coming together. Where does the movement, where do the indigenous peoples put the pressure now? Is enough being done? Are you confident that leaders will see this through?
Are we confident? I think we're optimistically cautious, right, about this process. Just because if you look at the history of indigenous peoples, for example, treaties. We have treaties with governments. We are governments, right? But the way the laws get changed and the way that implementation happens at home, sometimes we see there's a lot of inequity in that. And so where we take it, we have to take it at the local level. We have to keep applying pressure at the international level, which is what we're doing. But really, we have to bring our folks on the ground, the people that are affected most, right? Because often in this dialogue now, everybody's very euphoric. But what will happen now is we'll see a push for fast-track development. And often when we see fast-track development, that affects the most vulnerable on the ground, and indigenous peoples are right there, as I said, on the front lines. So that concerns us, and that's why we're here. That's why we're speaking up. That's why you see folks speaking out, not only at the United Nations, but also protest, right, happening. For example, in the United States, we have a very large protest of American Indian people out at Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, protesting a large pipeline. Why are they protesting that pipeline is because there was no consultation, really, bringing that pipeline, that development, that fast-tracking that development right near the reservation when they were first slated to bring that pipeline within 30 miles of a predominantly non-indigenous community, Bismarck, North Dakota. And then they said, no, well, we have concerns about our water. Right. But then they were able to move this. So they said, okay, you guys have concerns about that water. So we'll move this pipeline. Where did they move it? Within 10 miles of the indigenous community. Right. So why was it okay for them to move it when people had concerns about water 30 miles away, but it's okay to put this pipeline near an indigenous community 10 miles away? So these are the type of things that we're talking about. We have the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We have international standards that talk about our rights, a free, prior, informed consent. Right? This is what we were pushing. This is not what appeared in the SDGs or in the climate agreement, although we were pushing that. We are satisfied that at least we talk about in the preamble, it says, mentions indigenous people's rights. But now we really have to call the nations to task on that. We have to look at the national level. Where are we, right? We were invisible from the Millennium Development Goals. So now we're talking about near invisibility in this process as well, which is why I have to be really engaged in the indicator process. And that's where we see really mobilization locally, but really keeping the pressure up internationally.
And Susan, you've done more than anyone with the non-governmental liaison service here at the UN to open the UN up to civil society voices, the voices of indigenous people, the voices of people from all different communities. Are we where we need to be now as we embark upon this Agenda 2030, or are we still not really listening to the voices of civil society at the United Nations, do you think?
I think the classic answer here is there's many UNs within the UN. So there are parts of the UN that are very civil society friendly and understand the value and see the purpose and the partnership. For example, the Office of the President of the General Assembly, and highest respect to the office for the last 3 years, have been exceptional for expanding civil society participation. The Office of the Secretary General, the same. Many of the UN agencies are very civil society friendly, have civil society focal points, and see the value brought. Many member states are as well, but there is clear tension, as everyone knows, about what the role of civil society at the UN should be. It's an intergovernmental body. How much space do we have available for civil society? You see it in the modalities negotiations on process after process. There's a fight about whether member states should have the right to object to an NGO and whether it needs to be transparent. Our view at UN NGLS is we can organize this well. We can negotiate, we see where the member states end on what the available space will be. Then we work out a process that's meeting the needs of the member state, trying to expand the space for civil society, because that's actually our mandate, to build the role of civil society. And we just organize it well. We help civil society to be informed well, to understand what they have space for at the UN. We push a little, but not too much. Like, for example, in the Secretary General candidate questions process, where we opened up a completely new space through a careful discussion together with your office. That was unprecedented. People started to see the value. They said, this is interesting. Wow, it's like a halftime show. The civil society questions, we like them. They're introducing something new.
Right.
In other places, it's still a little bit, I would say, maybe regressive, because I think this is where the world is headed. I think we're going to need more openness, more transparency, and more participation to really overcome the challenges like you're describing. So all solutions are always going to be known best by the people who are affected by the problems. We have to have them at the table when we're designing the policy.
Thank you. Now, let's open it up to questions. We've got a distinguished panel here. Do we have a microphone that we can pass around the audience here? Does anyone have a question for our panelists about this extraordinary civil society support movement towards climate action on the Agenda 2030? I'm going to open the questions, open the floor up to questions if anyone has a question. Otherwise, we'll keep going. Okay, I don't see anyone rushing to ask a question.
Dan, I
Please.
would like to come back on what Roberto said.
Please.
While our audience gets their wits around them and asks us, I'm sure, very sharp questions. What Roberto was talking about, and also what Sue was talking about, I think is about inclusion. And one of the concerns I have is that we talk a lot about sustainable, and we sort of understand that inclusivity and equity are embedded in sustainability, and they should be, just as resilience. But I think we also need in the coming years to really unpack that it's about sustainability, it's about inclusion, it's about resilience. And they're all in the same space, and they all feed on each other, and it can be a virtuous cycle. But we have to make sure that it's there. And that is where we need to have very inclusive processes, also for development of the NDCs, for unpacking what does climate action mean at country level, both for mitigation as well as for adaptation. And that, I think, is going to be the strength of the process. If these two agendas coming together can help countries in a participatory way understand what are their trajectories for growth and for inclusion, not for now and not for 5 years. What are we going to be like in 2050 and 2060? And that, I think, is what we really need to keep. That's the real ambition for sustainability, for inclusion, for resilience, and for equity.
Roberta, are the indigenous people feeling included in this process, do you think?
Well, I think that the process has been better than it has been in the past. There's been, we had about 6 mentions in the climate change agreement, about the same in the SDGs. And I would agree, it's about inclusion. They say in our circles, if you're not at the table, then you're probably on the menu. Right. So, we want to make sure that we're at the table, and we need to be. We are there. We're talking ultimately about the distribution, the management, the exploitation of the last of the natural resources left on Earth, right? And that's where our people live. That's where we have a spiritual relationship. That's where we're thinking about not only our present, but our future generations. And all these buzzwords have now come into the system, and people are using them, but our people have been talking about them since time immemorial. Yes. We need to be in the conversation, and I think that's why we're here. We have some acknowledgement about that. States are getting better at talking about rights, for example, but now we really have to talk about implementation. It's not just about, okay, we put this on paper, this is what we need to do, but they need to remember that when we get home.
Yeah. Susan, do you think world leaders, are beginning to see the value of having civil society participate in meetings? I mean, how can that be improved? How can that take us forward as the 2030 agenda really begins to unfold over the next 14 years?
I think it's absolutely undeniable that the quality of the presentations and the quality of the inputs has improved in recent years with the participatory process, such as the process to develop the SDGs and all these other high-level meetings that have been going on. When we see a more open and transparent and democratized process, we're getting a more authentic voice. I think if people are here too long and they start to adopt the speak of the UN, it's almost like you're indoctrinated into something, and change becomes harder. We've been really freshening that up by putting completely open and transparent calls for applications. And as I have the honor to sit next to Roberto today, the thing I want to reflect on is back to March 2014, the first time we ran an open process, and it was right when the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples was debating whether or not Indigenous peoples could co-facilitate that process. And since that time, we've seen, as we've got civil society deciding its own speakers over and over and over again, they prioritize the voice of indigenous peoples. And then we've expanded our understanding, and I think we're getting better policy as a result. So it's going to take time, but our mission is to have the member states see that it is a good thing, that we can bring value with this.
Terrific. We've got time for one question, so I'm going to go to the gentleman at the back. If you could identify yourself and then ask your question, we'll try and get an answer, and then we're going to wrap up the session. Sir.
I'm chairman of the Dakia Institute. I actually just want to acknowledge the last question and the last answers. You know, it's not all about protecting the indigenous peoples. They have huge wisdom to share about agriculture and about animal farming and so on. And we need to be listening. So I'd just like to acknowledge the panel and the work that they're doing in that area. I think it's highly important.
Thank you. Thank you for the reaction. We're going to wrap it up there. So I'm going to thank my colleague. This is Paula Caballero from the World Resources Institute, Roberto Barrero, the International Indian Treaty Council, and Susan Alsner, the head of the United Nations Non-Governmental Liaison Service. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll wrap it up there. Thank you. Thank you.